Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with y'all today, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about Pennies for Peace, but also tell you a story a little bit in the process. So we're going to go to some slides, and at the end, hopefully we'll have told you enough of an interesting story and shared an idea with you, and you may have some questions based out of that. So what I want to do is walk you through the story of Greg Mortensen, and Greg spoke today at the NYLC's plenary session, telling a little bit about his story and how he's come to do what he does. And it starts with his books. He has four of them now actually, but it really starts with his book, 3 Cups of Tea, that came out about 6 years ago. And 3 Cups of Tea tells the journey of his life from mountain climber to humanitarian. 2 years ago, it was developed into a young reader's book as well as a children's picture book. And we have worked our Pennies for Peace toolkit around these 3 books, and I'll tell you more about that a little bit later. So Greg's story technically starts at the home of NYLC because he was born in Minnesota. But when he was 3 months old, his parents were missionaries, Lutheran missionaries, and they took Greg to Tanzania. They had the opportunity there to try and help build schools and build teaching hospitals, and they thought it was a wonderful adventure. And Greg, at 3 months old, and their first child, came with them to Tanzania. So he grew up here at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro in the little town of Moshi. And he was very happy in that experience growing up. And while he was growing up there were 3 other sisters that were born to the family. And the youngest sister, who you see here on the right, is Krista. Krista was born, and when she was born, Greg was made her godfather. And it was a very meaningful role to him. He was 12 years older than Krista, and he took his job very seriously, and especially took it seriously when Krista, at a very young age, had a severe reaction to an immunization. Her whole arm that she was immunized in turned black, and after that point, she recovered, but she was never quite the same. She never learned and progressed in the same way that she had before, and she developed very severe epilepsy. And Greg always has said that she was the best person in the family. She was always sunny and bright and always looked on the positive side of things, and she tried to be just like her brothers and sisters, in spite of the fact that it was harder for her to do things and it took longer and she was slower. She was determined not to be left out and determined to be just like everybody else. So Greg was very protective of her and wouldn't let anybody tease her, and took his job both as her older brother and as her godfather very seriously. Well, as you can imagine, with Mount Kilimanjaro, the background of where he grew up, Greg was very curious about climbing the mountain. This is a picture of Greg at 11 years old. He was so passionate and excited about climbing the mountain that he insisted his parents let him do that, and they hired a guide, and at 11 years old, he climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And he was so excited, and it was such an amazing experience that it created a lifelong love of mountain climbing in him. And that is what took him to his broader journey that we're going to talk about. When he was in Africa, he experienced all kinds of wonderful things. He grew up with kids from all different cultural backgrounds. They were from all different religious backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. It was a real expatriate community. There were Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs, you name it. He thought everybody grew up this way. Everybody grew up with a rainbow of children around them. And one of the things he learned in Africa was a proverb that stayed with him. And it said, if you educate a boy, you educate an individual, but if you educate a girl, you educate a community. And that's something that has stayed with him to this day, and as the story progresses, you'll see how that's made a difference. Like I said earlier, Greg and his family went to Tanzania, and his father was put in charge of building the first teaching hospital, the Kilimanjaro Christian Medical Center. And his dad was put in charge of raising the funds for that. And it took many, many years, but then he was finally able to raise all the funds for it, and the hospital was built. And at that point, Greg's family decided that since they'd been away for 15 years from the United States and from Minnesota, they thought that this would be the time now to take the kids back home and let them have an American experience as American citizens that they'd never really had because they'd always been in Africa. And Greg was very excited. He would always read the clippings that were sent from Minnesota to them out in Tanzania, and would read and reread them, and he'd read about baseball and firecrackers and 4th of July and all of the kinds of things he was very curious about seeing in real life. And they moved back to Minnesota, and he went to St. Paul Central for high school. And on the first day of high school, there was a bit of a misunderstanding because from Greg's perspective, he had grown up in Africa, and that's where he was from. And so he introduced himself as, hi, Greg, I'm from Tanzania, I'm an African. And the kids did not get that. They did not understand that. It did not make sense to them, and there were some hard feelings. And it surprised Greg because he'd never really experienced racism in Tanzania. He'd grown up with a rainbow of kids there, but it was actually in this country where kids had a hard time understanding him, and it was really just out of a misunderstanding and a miscommunication. Fortunately, football is a level playing field, and Greg was a good football player, so he navigated high school just fine. And 2 days after high school was over, he did something which was very unusual for the time. He enlisted in the Army. The family, when they came back from Africa, really didn't have a lot of money. They were very poor, and Greg really wanted an education, and he consulted his father, and his father said, you need to do what I did. I went into the Army. I was able to serve my country, and then my country served me by giving me an opportunity for an education, and that's what I would do. And so that's what Greg did. But it was sort of the height of the Vietnam War, the post-Vietnam War, and going into the Army was not a popular thing. But Greg found it an amazing and extraordinary experience because he met kids from all over the country, from the ranch lands of Montana to the Bronx, from the south side of LA to kids on the prairie in Iowa. He met kids from everywhere, and he realized that the great strength of the United States is in its diversity. And he realized that everybody that came together in the Army each had a strength and a unique role to play, and it was because of that diversity that made them so strong at what they did. And after his stint in the Army, he was honorably discharged, and he went back to school. And he took his role as Krista's godfather very seriously. He continued to take it seriously. Krista had developed very severe epilepsy at this point, and so she wasn't allowed to drive. But he helped her navigate the bus system in St. Paul, helped her find a job and a place to live so that she could really be independent despite her disability. And he was also very encouraging of her, and every summer they would do something special together. They might go to the Daytona 500 or the Kentucky Derby, or he'd take her climbing. And it was a very special times for them and very bonding moments. Well, Krista fell in love with a baseball movie called Field of Dreams. Now, those of us who are a little older are very well acquainted with this film, but some of the younger kids that we get to talk to don't know of it. We have to encourage them to go see it. And it's all about a farmer in Iowa who plows under part of his cornfield to build a baseball field because he hears this voice that says, if you build it, he will come. Krista loved this movie, and she would watch it over and over and over again. And she wanted nothing more than to go to the Field of Dreams in Dyersville, Iowa. And so her family finally agreed, we'll take you to the Field of Dreams for your birthday. But in the night from her 22nd to her 23rd birthday, Krista died of a massive epileptic seizure. And it was something that really hit the family hard. Greg would always talk about how great Krista was and the best person in the family, and there'd always been somebody that they had revolved around because she'd had such a sunny disposition, and now she was gone. And Greg, as a mountain climber, decided he wanted to find the biggest, baddest mountain he could climb and put Krista's little amber necklace that she'd gotten on the coast of Africa and put it up there to commemorate her and to honor her in some way. He felt a deep need to do that as a climber. And he was invited on an expedition to K2. And while it's the second highest mountain in the world, it's arguably the most difficult to climb. It's at a higher northern latitude than Mount Everest. It's not much shorter than Mount Everest, but it's much more exposed, much steeper, and very prone to avalanche and adverse conditions. Here you see an example of what can happen on K2. This is a massive avalanche coming off of K2. And if you look down into the far right-hand corner, you'll see a few blue blobs. If you look very closely, you'll see those blue blobs. Those are tents from an expedition. And that shows you, if you think about a tent standing, 4 or 5 feet high, just look at how massive that avalanche is by comparison. And so climbing on K2 usually was the process of getting up very early in the morning, around 1 in the morning, and climbing through the night into the early morning, say 9 o'clock or so, 10 o'clock, and then by 10 o'clock you'd be at your next camp, and then you'd hunker down, because as soon as the sun warmed the mountain and warmed the snow, big avalanches and rockfall like this would happen. Here's a camp of Greg and his team high up on K2. So if you see the 2 tents on the sort of middle left side of the picture, that's actually, those tents are pitched in China. This is the Northwest Ridge, and K2 stands on the border between China and Pakistan. So these tents are technically in China. But Greg has said since they didn't see any gun-toting Chinese border guards up there, and even though they didn't have a Chinese visa, they felt like they were reasonably secure pitching their tents there and then traversing up the slope and back over to the right into Pakistan. Greg and his team spent 78 days on K2 trying to get to the summit, and Greg didn't make it to the summit. He failed to make it to the summit in part because he participated in a very intense high-altitude rescue of a teammate who had developed pulmonary edema. There was fluid filling the lungs of this teammate of Greg's, and even though he and another teammate had just been on a day of stalking a high camp, and you're supposed to climb high on these mountains and then come back down and rest low. It's very challenging climbing this high at these extreme altitudes. And he and his other teammate noticed SOS signs with a flashlight high on the mountain, and they knew that something was wrong. And so they had to go back up and rescue their teammate. And in doing that, Greg really used up any energy reserves he had in order to reach the summit. And so he had to give up on his hope to reach the summit. And he was really devastated by that. And Krista's death had been such a shocking thing, and he was trying to make some sense of it by placing her necklace on the summit. And he hadn't been able to do that. He was devastated by not being able to make that symbolic presenting of her necklace on the summit. And he had it in his pocket when he was walking off of, or when he walked out of base camp from K2. And this is Greg with his big backpack walking off K2, and it's a 7-day walk from base camp to a village where you grab a jeep into a larger town, and then from there heading back to where you can catch an airplane. And so for 7 days walking from K2 base camp out, Greg would feel this necklace in his pocket, and he would be reminded of the fact that he'd failed to honor Krista, and he'd failed to put this necklace on the summit of K2. He lost his way once on the glacier coming down from K2 base camp, and over time came into a village called Corfe Village. And he'd been expecting to be, he actually thought he was in a different village, and until he realized that he had made a mistake and he'd gotten into Corfe Village, and it was not where he had intended to be. And when he realized his mistake, he was a little surprised, and he was trying to find a way to get back to where he needed to be, but they graciously invited him in for a cup of tea, and it was late, and he stayed the night. And he realized it was fascinating to him, having grown up in Africa. He had seen poverty, but he'd not seen a place, he thought, as poor as this little village that he'd been to. But the people treated him with great kindness, and they gave him the best of what they had. And they tried to help nurse him back to health, because they could look at him, and climbers on these extreme mountain expeditions will often lose tremendous amounts of weight, and Greg had lost about 30, 40 pounds on this expedition, so they could tell that he was physically not well. But I think on some level they could also tell that he was emotionally not well. He was really disappointed in himself for not having managed to summit K2, and he was distressed and sad, and they could see that in his eyes, and they gave him the best of what they had to take care of him. And as he began to realize that they were doing that, he in turn tried to give the best of what he had. He was trained at this point as an emergency room trauma nurse, and he had a big first aid kit. And so he would take that first aid kit and go around the village trying to help in whatever way he could with whatever illnesses or injuries that he found. And that got him the nickname of Dr. Greg, which is what he is known as to this day, both in Pakistan and Afghanistan. It was kind of useless trying to explain to them that he was an emergency room trauma nurse, because as far as they could see, he was a doctor. And he noticed every day that the kids would be in the village and running around, and then they seemed to sort of at the same time every day leave and be gone, and he very naturally assumed that they had gone to school. And so one day he asked the village chief for a tour of the school. He wanted to see it. And the village chief was rather put out. He wasn't sure what to do. He seemed to hem and haw. And finally he took Greg behind the village to an opening under apricot trees, under an apricot orchard. And there Greg found 86 children doing their lessons, sitting on the dirt, doing their lessons with sticks in the sand. 4 or 5 of them had these boards like you see here, kind of like a chalkboard. It's painted wood, and they'd make a mud mixture, as you can see that this little boy's made with a jar, and they would write their lessons on their little slate board with mud, but the rest of the children were doing their lessons with sticks in the dirt. And Greg realized that this was their school. This is how they were being educated, and he was shocked. And he looked around. He saw all the children doing their work, but he couldn't identify where the teacher was. And when he asked where the teacher was, the village chief looked even more uncomfortable and said, well, we can't really afford the $1 a day that it takes to pay for a teacher. And so we are, our children have a teacher 3 days a week and share it with another village down the valley. But on the days that the teacher's not here, the children sit and do their work together. And Greg was shocked. He was amazed. He knew that in America, if children were to not have a teacher, most of them wouldn't even show up, let alone do their work. And it was at that moment that a light went on for him, and he recognized that he had the capacity to honor Krista in a completely different way, because he saw the same determination in these children that he would see in his little sister when she had to put her things out every night the night before and get herself well prepared and get up ahead of everybody else and get dressed in the morning because it was so hard for her to do it. The same determination shone through in the eyes of these children who were so determined to get an education and have the chance to live a better life. And at that moment, the light went on for Greg, and he looked at the village chief and he said, I'm going to build a school for you. And the village chief was very polite and was very kind and was very thankful, but he didn't really think much of it because most strangers that came to this part of the world never came back. So Greg went home, and he, as an emergency room trauma nurse, didn't really have a lot of history in fundraising. So he went to the library and tried to get some good ideas from the reference librarian, and they thought maybe it would be a good idea to write to famous people. So Greg wrote, or actually hand-typed, this was in the era before computers, he hand-typed 582 letters to famous people, rich people, movie stars, dear Sylvester Stallone, dear Oprah Winfrey, asking for their help to build, for funds to build this school. But nothing happened. After 6 months, he only got one reply from the journalist Tom Brokaw. And he was very down and sad about it, and he went to visit his mother, who was principal at an elementary school in Wisconsin. And she said to him, bring your slides and tell these kids a little bit about Pakistan, because they don't know much about that part of the world, and this will be a great way to educate them. So Greg spent 2 days walking around the classrooms of Westside Elementary School, talking to the kids about Pakistan and how he was trying to build a school. And on the second day, a little boy came up to him and said, I have a piggy bank at home, and I'm going to help you build that school. And he didn't think anything of it, and he went back home to Berkeley and continued working his job as a trauma nurse. And 6 weeks later, his mother called and said, boy, you made some impression on these kids. They were so excited. They couldn't believe that their peers like them halfway around the world didn't have a school, and so they decided they were going to help with whatever they could do. So they took 2 big trash cans and lined them with plastic liners and went around and encouraged all their friends to bring pennies. And at the end of 6 weeks, those kids had gathered 62,340 pennies, $623.40. And at the time, that was the largest donation that Greg had ever received. And it wasn't from rich people, and it wasn't from movie stars, and it wasn't from sports heroes, but it was from kids, helping kids just like themselves halfway around the world. And out of that experience, Greg realized that kids are interested, and kids have the capacity to learn and open their hearts and minds. And out of that, he developed the Pennies for Peace program. Well, the short story of the long story is that Greg finally was able to raise the funds to build the first school. And in 1996, the Corfe School was finished. And Greg realized that he had an opportunity to build more schools in this area, and especially schools for girls. Girls' education is a very important thing. In the developing world, there are approximately 100 to 130 million children worldwide who are unable to access education, due in part to gender, to poverty, to cultural traditions and religious beliefs. The numbers vary somewhat, but for the most part, they're due to all of these reasons, and a large number of that is girls. So why is girls' education so important? Well, in the developing world, when a girl gets educated to a 5th grade level or higher, a number of really important things happen. They tend to marry later and have smaller, healthier families. They tend to bring greater economic opportunities to themselves and their families. They end up passing on the value of education to their own children. And interestingly, girls' education appears to be a stabilizing force in emerging political structures. So really, all in all, as an investment, girls' education has the largest return on economic development for a developing society. So Greg was really determined that girls in these areas that he was helping communities to build schools with, that girls had an opportunity to go to school. And in many of these communities, that had never happened before. And little by little, this idea was embraced that at least 10% of the girls in a community would be able to go to school, and that number would be raised every year by 10%. And let me give you an example about what kind of an impression or what kind of a difference educating a girl can make. This is Aziza, and when she was a little girl in rural Charpusan Valley in northwest Pakistan, she wanted to go to school more than anything else. And it was very challenging for her. The people in her village didn't see the value in having a girl get educated. But her family finally agreed, and she went to school in her village. And the boys didn't know quite what to make of it. It had never happened before. They were uncertain whether they should accept her, and sometimes they didn't. They teased her. They gave her a very hard time. But she persevered, and she graduated from 8th grade. And then she wanted to get more of an education. And after much discussion, her family agreed that she could go to high school in a larger village down valley, but she would have to do it with her brother. That's the way that it would be culturally appropriate. And so she went down valley with her brother and went to high school. And again, the boys at high school, it was difficult for them because, again, that had never happened before. And they gave her a very hard time as well, but she persevered and she graduated from high school. And then she wanted more education. And so Greg sent her on to a maternal health care training, basically like a nurse's training. And then she came back to Charpusan Valley. Now, there are about 4 or 5 villages in Charpusan Valley, about 3,000 to 4,000 people there. And before Aziza got her education, up to 20 women a year would die from childbirth complications because they didn't have anyone there to help them. But ever since Aziza has returned, not a single woman has died from childbirth complications. And in addition, Aziza is able to go around to villages and teach nutrition and hygiene so that simple things that don't bother us certainly don't kill us. While they may be uncomfortable, they don't kill us. Like diarrhea, something that can kill babies and older people. Aziza is able to help them learn how how to take care of themselves so that does not happen. She's made a tremendous impact in her community, but she's remained very much the same as who she was. She's very quiet and soft-spoken. She wears a headscarf just like everybody else or all the other women in the village. She hasn't really changed much beyond the fact that she has a job that brings income into her family and is making a difference in the lives of her fellow villagers. What's really clear about the impact that Aziza has made is that now in the schools in Charpusan Valley, dozens and dozens of little girls are being taken to school, are being invited to go to school. And that's the kind of generational change that makes a difference in a community. Now, this is a picture of a friend of Greg's, Colonel Christopher Kolenda. He wrote an email to Greg several years ago, and I'm just going to read part of it, but it's a pretty telling part. Colonel Kolenda was working in a very volatile province called Kunar province, and he sent Greg this email. And the most important part of this email says, the conflict here will not be won with bombs, but with books and ideas that excite the imagination towards peace, tolerance, and prosperity. The thirst for education here is palpable. Education will make the difference whether the next generation grows up to be educated patriots or illiterate fighters. The stakes could not be higher. I think it's worth repeating those last two sentences. Education will make the difference whether the next generation grows up to be educated patriots or illiterate fighters. The stakes could not be higher. I think we can take those sentences and apply them to children in every country all around the world. Education will make the difference whether the next generation grows up to be educated patriots or people who are illiterate on any level and are fighting for something that does not serve themselves or their communities or the world at large. The stakes could not be higher. He's so right. So out of this work now, hundreds of schools, almost hundreds of schools, 170 schools have been built, and thousands, tens of thousands of children have been sent to school. And the Pennies for Peace Toolkit was developed 2 years ago to really lift Pennies for Peace to the next level for its education, or its educational value. Taking the 3 books that Greg has written, 3 Cups of Tea, the young reader version of 3 Cups of Tea, and Listen to the Wind, the Pennies for Peace Toolkit created a professionally written, standards-aligned K-12 curriculum with rubrics, assessment tools, activity reproducibles, and all kinds of tools and references that make this really helpful. An implementation guide, a book and movie reference list, fact sheets, maps, printable postcards, stickers, and poster components, sample letters for parents and sample press releases, all kinds of wonderful tools that can be used in this process, and 13 videos that really help tell the story of Pennies for Peace, and also have some curricular insight into what life is like in Pakistan and Afghanistan. This information can easily be found at the Pennies for Peace website, where you can go to register for the program if you choose to participate, as well as to find the free curriculum and the tools and the videos. So it's at penniesforpeace.org. That's our main website. And then once you're at that website, you can click on the Pennies for Peace Toolkit that has all of these incredible reference materials. And now Greg has written the book Stones into Schools, which was released about a year and 2 or 3 months ago. And we're in the process of working on a K-12 curriculum for this. There's now actually going to be a Stones into Schools young reader, as well as a Stones into Schools picture book, which is actually going to be called Listen to the Children. And so by the late fall, early winter, we should have a Stones into Schools K-12 curriculum in place as well. To help youth and educators understand more about this region and understand that they have the capacities to make change happen in the world. And so that's sort of the story I was here to tell you today.
Thank you so much, Christiana. That was a great story. And we asked for questions if you have them, and then also I have wrote down a few questions as we were going, so I'll kind of hold those to you, and if you have questions online, feel free to kind of send them in. But I think the story of Greg coming down K2 is really powerful, and seeing those children, kind of sitting under, that Africa trees. What do you think kids in the U.S. can learn from those students who have such a dedication to their education?
That's a great question. I think it's especially interesting to kids here, that idea of, especially to younger kids, it's like, what do you mean they don't have a school? Everybody has a school. And then kids here start to understand that well, maybe everybody doesn't have a school. They have such a hard time believing that that could even exist. And they have such a hard time believing, wow, you really have kids that don't have papers, and they don't have pencils, and they don't have books. And we make the analogy that a penny can buy a pencil, and a pencil is sort of the beginning of literacy and can open the door to a better life for kids. And so that idea of a penny and a pencil makes a lot of sense to kids. And the reality is that kids, once they start that, it's kind of like unraveling a ball of yarn. Once they start pulling on that thread, they're like, really? And it takes, a teacher only earns $1 a day, or now about $2 a day, and they begin to make the sort of exchanges in their own head about how much you can do with very little in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And they, in some ways, we hope they actually even begin to value what they have more, because they realize that it's actually a very special thing and that not everybody has that kind of thing.
That's great. I know you travel all over and you see these Pennies for Peace projects. Do you have some examples of the ways that students and teachers have implemented this curriculum, or kind of one of your favorite stories of something you've heard?
Well, I think one of my favorite, well, I have two. It's so hard. It's so hard to choose. I have two, I have three, I have four. No, well, a few years ago, actually, I've got to tell you three. It's great. It's amazing what people do with Pennies for Peace. They find such creative ways to do it. So one of the earliest experiences I had with Pennies for Peace was visiting the community of Rockford, Illinois. And Rockford's an industrial town, and it's been hit pretty hard by economic downturn. And yet Rockford used Pennies for Peace and 3 cups of tea and really pulled their community together. And as a whole community, working with libraries and schools and private schools and public schools, and everybody came together around this one purpose of wanting to bring Greg to their community to speak, but more importantly, understanding, reading the book, understanding what an amazing story this was, and how, while it might be tough for them in Rockford, it's tougher in other places. And over the course of a year's time, they did all kinds of events in their community, and they raised over $100,000 for us to build schools. And it was just a remarkable experience. And what was really remarkable was hearing the educators in those communities saying, this has pulled us together as a community. We're tighter, we're closer. You know, where there might have been rivalries, we suddenly find ourselves as friends and as pulling together for a common purpose. And so it was a really powerful catalyst to bring a school community, a whole community together, not just the school community. And so it was very, very meaningful and very exciting to see that happen, and they've become incredible advocates of our work. It's also, I was at a school about a year ago in New Jersey, just outside of New York, about 30 minutes, and these kids, it was a lot. I guess you guys are used to seeing this on a daily basis at NYLC, but I get to see it on occasion, not all the time. And these kids, these high school kids, were so well-spoken and so articulate, and CNN actually came out and did a story on them because they had pulled together and they had raised an enormous amount of money as well, but they had raised the awareness in their school community. They'd educated their peers, like these kids who were in charge had really educated all the rest of the kids in their school community. And you could see how powerful they felt after, and powerful in sort of the way that you want powerful to be, which is empowering. They understood that they had the capacity to tell their peers about an issue, to educate them, and then to make change happen around that. And I think the most recent thing I've seen, which just completely knocked my socks off, was in Cincinnati, Ohio. There's a Jewish school and a Muslim school in Cincinnati, Ohio. And they came together as 2 distinct communities, reading 3 cups of tea together. And yet the way they did it is, first, they were in their separate schools, and they started reading the books, each of them in their separate schools. And then kids started corresponding between grades at this school, And then the Muslim school went to visit the Jewish school for their second cup of tea. So their first cup of tea was like the exchange of the letters. The second cup of tea was the Muslim kids going to the Jewish school. And then I got to visit when the Jewish kids came and visited the Muslim school. And it was so fascinating. These kids were friends. They had made friends. They found commonalities between their two religions, which if you look around the world is considered to be two of the most contentious religions in the world, and yet these kids came together. And what was amazing is when they went into their holy places and would open up a book, like I remember the kids in the Muslim school telling me, well, we went to the synagogue and they opened their Torah and they read us one of their very common prayers. And it sounded almost like one of our prayers. I mean, you could see the aha moments happening for these kids of, wow, we actually share the basis for religion, and our prayer kind of sounds like your prayer, and, you know, we have certain rituals that you guys do, and some of it's different, and, you know, it's easy to see the differences. But what was amazing is to see them coming around to these commonalities and feeling like they had a friend now. You know, I see this program as having the capacity to wage peace in articulate hands, and that's incredibly moving and incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and I think that connects to service learning a lot. I see is that they're making the change outside of their community. You know, they're raising money for people around the world, but then they're also, you know, they're making those changes in their home community, and they're doing it with each other. And I think that's really special, and that's, you know, the change that you look for in service learning, and the change that can really, really affect students.
I think that's the key, is that no matter where that service learning takes place, it's that sort of education of self and then those around you that has that powerful sort of starting effect. And it's a lifelong effect at that point. I remember seeing a letter from either a student or a teacher sending me a student's letter of, I think it was a little boy who's like, I just never knew, and now I'll always know. And that idea that this child learned that by being really astute and educating himself, he would always know. Now he has the capacity to understand that it's his job to learn about a lot of things, about all these different places in the world, because then he'll know and understand. It's just, that's sort of what gives you hope.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important thing of being able to connect with people, because I think that Perry Mortensen was speaking earlier today at the plenary. He was saying if you want to be involved in service learning, you have to be able to touch poverty and see it and hear it and smell it. I think if you need to walk the walk, you need to talk the talk too, and being able to experience that thing is a really important thing, because then you can empathize it. That's really important, because you can go and you can do community service and you can raise money, but until I think you experience that and you really like see like, wow, this is having an effect on someone over in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. You can see like what your results are being produced with. I think that's an amazing thing too. I think that's like where kids feel like I can make a difference even though I can't vote yet.
Right.
That's great.
Right. I think you're so right about that, and I think you bring up a really good point of sometimes that experience has to be out. Like, you have to almost be uncomfortable about what you're experiencing. It's not easy. It's not pretty. It shouldn't be sanitized. Sometimes you have to touch it, feel it, like he says, you know, smell it. You have to have that intense experience, and it's not always comfortable. But sometimes it's in that space of discomfort where you stretch yourself enough to sort of start looking at things in such a profoundly different way, where you then see that you really, this is how you make change. You don't just make change by writing a check. That's not what it's about. So I think that point is really important.
And I think like another thing too is something like my organization always says, like no one says it was going to be easy. It's just going to be worth it.
That's a great
phrase. Our marching band says, because when we go to state, like nothing to do with service learning, but like we have like a 3-month intensive period of like working together and getting to your goal, or whether that's doing some kind of competition or doing like a service project and getting to your final result. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to be worth it in the end.
And I think the challenge is, and that's why what NYLC does is so important, is that that idea of no one said it was going to be easy, just worth it, that's not really part of our culture. Our culture is all about easy. Make it easy, relax. It's like, yes, take care of yourself, but it's not always going to be easy, and that's okay. In fact, that's part of the program. In fact, the most important things in your life are not always going to be easy. And so if that's something that, kids can get, it's huge.
That's great. There's a question that came online as well. Can you give us an example of a lesson for younger grades, say grade 1 or 2?
And I have to tell you that I don't have the toolkit memorized by heart, but it comes out of the lesson plans. There's actually one called the culture quilt, where you take it's a lesson plan in the toolkit where kids make pictures of what is their culture, and then that's pasted together. And then I've seen schools also take it as to how do you, from what you've read, what is your experience of what the culture is like there, and they draw those pictures and create it. I saw some beautiful culture quilts hanging on the wall at the Muslim school in Cincinnati. And it's all, the nice thing about all of these lesson plans is it's open source on the website. All you have to do is go to the Pennies for Peace website and click on the toolkit, and everything you'd ever want is there for you to print off. It's an open source website or resource that we want everybody to use.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us for today's session. Do you have any more questions? No, I'm this has been great, and I'm really glad that the teachers have an opportunity to look at that curriculum online, and I think that's great for teachers. So I just want to thank everyone online for joining us today. For more information about the presentation and for other webinars like this one you saw today, you can become a member of the GSN, and that is gsn.nylc.org. So you can see that online, and again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you online.